The submarine, silent, efficient, and deadly. It was one of the ultimate weapons of World War II. Yet there's a secret side to the submarine war. The Second World War was a battleground for tiny, deadly submarines whose very existence was kept a closely guarded secret. These clandestine craft and their crews were unsung heroes of the war. Their attacks were often as deadly to the pilots as they were to the enemy. From the secret missions of German U-boats to the unique vehicles of demolition in the Mediterranean to the terrifying miniature kamikaze subs of Japan, the clandestine use of secret submarines remains one of the little-known tales of World War II. In the shadowy world of espionage, the submarine was seen not as a soldier, but a spy. Not a warrior, but an assassin.
Submarines are, by nature, stealthy, difficult to find. It's very, very hard to see through water. So in the clandestine world of spies, saboteurs, intelligence collection, submarines have become a very important system, a very important weapon, if you will.
Submarines start off, of course, as a weapon of secrecy. During World War II, the Germans looked upon them as potentially the best way to get saboteurs to the United States.
Submarines have been part of the naval order of battle since the start of this century. As submarines got bigger, there was a requirement for small, specially designed craft for these special operations, and that is what now we mean by midget submarines.
The most basic unit of underwater warfare is not the submarine, but rather the swimmer. From the time ancient Greek divers bored holes in the sides of enemy warships, the frogman has been an inherent part of clandestine underwater activity. By World War II, frogmen were necessary for any beach invasion. Mines and underwater obstacles often protected shorelines. Air reconnaissance could discover the obstacles, but someone had to remove them.
Once the obstacles were located, they had to be destroyed. How do you destroy them? You send in swimmers, what we soon called underwater demolition teams. Exceedingly brave, well-trained men who would come into the area by landing craft, then swim out to these obstacles, wire them with demolitions, and blow them up.
In 1942, within months of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy and the newly created Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, began to train an elite squad of underwater warriors. This once classified film shows a secret camp in the Bahamas that trained Navy and OSS personnel to be saboteurs of the sea.
They went through arduous physical training. They all, of course, had to be expert swimmers. You're going to swim a few hundred yards from the landing craft to the obstacles. You were going to stay in the water for minutes, possibly an hour or more, while you carried out your mission, and then have to swim back several hundred yards to the landing craft. So the physical requirements, as well as the technical training needed to do the survey, to plan explosives, was tremendous.
The training of the swimmers included not only the use of explosives, but the teaching of unique swimming techniques, close combat, and training in special breathing equipment. Scuba gear had not been invented in 1942. American divers carried bottled oxygen with a special apparatus that recycled the swimmer's exhalation. No telltale bubbles would betray the swimmer's whereabouts. The danger, however, was that pure oxygen, as an extremely volatile gas, had surprising effects on the human nervous system. Prolonged breathing of pure oxygen can cause convulsions, a stroke, or sudden death. A Navy or OSS swimmer risked his life even before coming near the enemy. Yet the dangerous training of underwater demolition teams was one of the key factors in the success of the Allied war effort.
Underwater demolition teams were vital to the invasion of Europe in June of '44, vital to the invasion of many of the Pacific Islands that we undertook. Vital because every invasion was costly. Hundreds of American lives were lost in the landing operations. There's no question, if underwater demolition teams had not destroyed some of the defenses, if they had not surveyed the areas so we knew where they were, the losses would have been not in the hundreds, but in the thousands for those landings.
In addition to destroying harbor and beach defenses, Navy and OSS swimmers also attacked ships themselves. A single man could go into areas torpedoes or aircraft could not. The Allies were determined to find a way for a single swimmer with the right equipment to take out a target. The key was to invent the right equipment with an explosive device small enough to be carried by one man, but powerful enough to do the job.
You had to have a way to effectively get a watertight explosive, hold it close to the ship, and ignite an explosion. So they devised the limpet mine. The center portion is 2.5 pounds of high explosive that's watertight. On the outside are 6 magnets. Now, they're individually mounted in rubber so that they could conform to the hull of a ship even if there's barnacles on it. With 2.5 pounds of explosive snug against the hull, once it goes off, the incompressibility of water will focus the entire explosion into the hull. And this is designed to produce a hole roughly 25 square feet in size beneath the waterline.
Allied underwater demolition teams, or UDTs, were responsible for sinking hundreds of tons of shipping in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Mediterranean. Not only were these seagoing saboteurs successful, they helped pave the way for the future.
After World War II, of course, these UDT teams became the basis for the famous SEAL organizations, or Sea, Air, Land, that we formed during the Vietnam War. And these are among the top special forces in the world today.
The U.S. Navy SEALs, famed all over the world, had their beginnings on the island of Nassau in World War II, where underwater operatives using comparatively primitive equipment trained for some of the riskiest and most dangerous assignments in the entire war. It didn't take long for military planners to devise unique underwater vehicles to perform similar demolition missions. These clandestine weapons, some of the smallest submarines ever devised, soon joined the ocean-going fleets of larger submarines and U-boats in the arsenal of modern underwater warfare. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating to the U.S. Navy. Bombers and torpedo planes sank 7 American battleships. 2 days later, a Japanese air assault in the Philippines crippled the U.S. Asiatic Fleet. Commander Stuart Murray of the naval base at Manila underlined the importance of the U.S. undersea force when, after surveying the wreckage of the American fleet, he said, The submarines are all we have left. But before the Navy could strike back, it had to go undercover. The first U.S. submarine sorties against Japan were not for combat. They were missions of espionage.
Submarines are very good for just looking at an area. And in some operations, such as planning for an amphibious landing, a submarine's periscope view gives you a better look at the beach sometimes than an aircraft flying over, because you're now seeing it from the level of the troops going in. You could get some excellent photographs of the water level view. And again, this would be very important for amphibious landings, so that you could get an idea of what the troops and the landing craft coming ashore would see.
Photo reconnaissance through a periscope was not easy. The nerve-wracking process involved moving close to shore and then filming a 180-degree panorama, sometimes while under enemy fire. American submarines were needed for more than just photographing beaches. Fast fleet subs were needed to attack enemy shipping lanes. Nearly 1/5 of all the American subs were obsolete S-class ships built in the 1920s. They were small, slow, and difficult to maneuver. As the American fleet geared up to combat readiness, the older S-class subs found new life as a transport system on secret underwater missions.
Once the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, we immediately found that it was difficult to get surface ships in and out of the northern Philippines, especially the main island of Luzon, because of Japanese aircraft, Japanese surface ships. So we increasingly use submarines both to carry things in, primarily ammunition, supplies, and to carry things out. At one point we carried out a large number of Army nurses to carry out certain specialists that we either didn't want the Japanese to capture, such as cryptographers, code breakers, or other people that we just needed because they were in short supply, such as aircraft mechanics.
They called these older subs the Spy Squadron and their mission Operation Spyron. 19 submarines were involved in Operation Spyron throughout World War II. The USS Sea Dragon evacuated American codebreakers from Corregidor in 1942. The USS Swordfish helped Philippine President Manuel Quezon flee from the Japanese occupation. The USS Narwhal landed U.S.-trained Philippine guerrillas on the shores of Mindanao. In all, over 1,300 tons of supplies and arms were delivered to the Philippine resistance in this manner. One of the most dramatic rescues by the USS Trout was a mission in February 1942 to deliver weapons and evacuate Army nurses. Yet for some, the most important evacuee was not the people, but rather gold.
The Trout goes into the Philippines, delivers the small arms, ammunition, and then takes out 20 tons of gold and silver from the Philippines. And it's deposited back in the United States for use by the Philippines at the end of the war. Well, the Trout gold becomes the basis for legend after legend after legend of Philippine gold. It still exists today.
The Philippine Commonwealth's gold reserves were taken out by submarine, and some Army nurses. Now here you've got 60 or 70 men in the submarine, a load of gold, a dozen or so Army nurses, One wonders that they didn't defect to some desert island.
Far more dangerous than evacuating personnel from enemy territory was the exact opposite mission: inserting clandestine operatives behind enemy lines. Operation Spy-Run found itself the chief means of delivery for Allied spies in the Pacific. In addition to delivering Philippine resistance fighters and supplies, the secret subfleet put Americans onto Japanese-held islands as advanced scouts for the Allied forces. Called the Coast Watchers, these servicemen spent months, even years, behind enemy lines, reporting the movement of Japanese ships. One such mission was led by Sergeant Carlos Placido. In May 1944, Placido and 5 other Filipino-American servicemen boarded the submarine USS Redfin at Perth, Australia. The Army enlisted men were in disguise and under top-secret orders. Placido's diary from the time tells the story in his own words.
We reached Perth about 1800, 26 May 1944. We made a quick change from Army uniforms to that of the Navy and were warned not to mention that we were in the Army until we got on the sub. Major Brown said to take care of ourselves and that we were all going to meet again in Manila.
Days later, the USS Redfin surfaced off the shore of the Japanese-held Palawan Island group. Under cover of darkness, the group of 6 men went ashore with all the supplies they would need to survive behind enemy lines for over a year. Their mission was to set up and operate a clandestine radio station to report on all Japanese shipping activities. The Coast Watchers encountered hostile islanders, roving Japanese squadrons, and the unpredictable weather of the South Seas.
On 26 July, a Japanese gunboat anchored in the bay at 800 yards off the beach. It tried to land a patrol party, but the guerrillas held them off with rifles and shotguns. To help these boys, we turned over to them whatever extra arms we had. On 29 July, we turned on our transmitter. DAC was already sending weather reports every 6 hours. One of Colonel Whitney's first messages said, "Excellent reports."
The Coast Watchers would be at their remote island station for nearly a year before Japan was defeated. And just as their commander had promised, they all met in Manila to celebrate the Allied victory. For their service behind enemy lines, every man of the Coast Watchers received the Bronze Star for heroic achievement. But before the war ended, the Allies faced a new and deadly secret weapon. Silent and almost invisible, a new generation of underwater craft was employed to tip the balance of power in the Mediterranean in favor of the Axis. While the American submarines of the Pacific were engaged in secret missions, a unique type of underwater warfare was being perfected on the other side of the world. The Axis powers were intent on creating a new class of clandestine submarine, one that was small, fast, and deadly.
As experience of operating and working with submarines grew, there were certain roles for which these large submarines were no longer suitable, like entering enemy harbours, dropping off recovering agents, submarines which are specifically built for special operations.
They were called midget subs, X-craft, or sneak craft. The leaders in this development were the Italians. Mussolini's navy had created an elite squadron of special attack weapons, the 10th Light Flotilla, or 10 Mas. The Special Attack Squadron began by improving an odd design from the First World War. Called the maiali, it was essentially a manned torpedo. The device carried 2 men who wore diving suits, masks, and used a primitive form of scuba gear. The forward man was the pilot who steered the craft underwater toward the target. This artist's conception from a once classified OSS film shows how the second man detached the torpedo's warhead and attached it to the targeted ship's hull. After setting a timed fuse, the drivers of the maiali then returned to their base. The concept was simple and ingenious. All it took was crude driving skills and steely nerve. The men of the 10th Flotilla had that kind of audacity. The maiali is actually a nickname, the Italian word for pig, given to the craft by one of its inventors, Sub-Lieutenant alias Tozai.
Well, its proper name is Siluro a lenta corsa, which means slow-running torpedo. But during trials, they had problems in keeping the things afloat. And once, after one sunk underneath Tozai, he said, "That pig got away from me." And the name stuck, and henceforth they were known as pigs.
One of the most daring and most successful raids by the 10th Flotilla was on the British Mediterranean harbor at Alexandria. In the same month as the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, 3 tiny maiali attacked Alexandria harbor. They wreaked havoc on the British ships there, shifting the balance of power in the Mediterranean.
3 craft were used. They were taken to just off the harbour at Alexandria by the Italian submarine Skirei, where the crews were released. They boarded the torpedoes and then went off to do their bit. As luck would have it, the gateway to Alexandria harbour was opened that night to allow British ships in, and they just followed in. They then went their 3 separate ways to find their targets. 2 of them succeeded in finding their targets, which were the battleships Valiant and Queen Elizabeth. The 3rd found its target, the tanker Sagona, and all were successful.
The mission was more than a victory for the 10th Flotilla. It was a bitter defeat for the entire British Navy.
The significance of the attack lies in that because these 2 battleships were damaged, the Royal Navy was effectively removed as an offensive force in the Eastern Mediterranean. Effectively, there was nothing, no serious Royal Navy force in the Mediterranean after these 2 battleships had been damaged.
The 10th Light Flotilla began to expand its repertoire. Exploding surface craft were the logical extension of the manned torpedo. These 16-foot boats had their noses filled with explosives. The operators simply pointed the craft toward the target, hit full speed, and then ejected before the craft hit. The boat could go where a pig could not, for its fold-away rudder allowed the boat to simply float over the top of protective anti-submarine nets. The exploding boat concept was copied by the Germans, who added a crude radio control system. The 10th Light Flotilla used both pigs and exploding boats in a dawn raid on the British harbor at Malta in July 1941. An exploding boat failed to destroy the harbor netting because the pilot ejected too soon. The second boat hit its mark, but only because its pilot, Lieutenant Carabelli, refused to eject, riding his speeding bomb to his own death. The attack on Malta was a failure, but it did not stop the Italian team. The 10th Flotilla now aimed its secret weapons at an even bigger target, the British harbor at Gibraltar. Headquartered secretly in an old Italian tanker, the Mialis attacked and sank British merchant ships at will. But the 10th Flotilla had a brazen plan that would top them all. A midget submarine attack on New York Harbor.
The attack on New York was perhaps the most audacious operations which the Dechimamas planned during the war. They planned to use a small midget submarine called a CA-class submarine, which would be carried in a well carved into the forward casing of a submarine called the Leonardo da Vinci. Now, even if they had just planted a couple of limpet mines on one or two hulls in New York Harbor and done the merest amount of damage, the fact that the Axis powers had actually got in to an American harbor and committed an act of aggression in American waters would have had huge psychological consequences.
But history stepped in between New York Harbor and her date with a pig. On September 3rd, 1943, Mussolini fled his collapsing government and Italy surrendered. The 10th Flotilla, one of Italy's few military success stories of the war, was disbanded. Unlike its Italian partners, the German Navy had little success with clandestine watercraft.
The German midget submarine program was a total disaster. All their submersibles and midget submarines were built in a hurry without proper testing, and they were just thrown into combat.
The German-designed Biber and Molk were one-man subs that carried 2 torpedoes. Neither sub had a single successful mission. The third one-man German sub was named the Neger.
The Neger was perhaps the most lethal one of all. This again was another single-man craft, and it consisted of 2 G7 electric torpedoes, one slung below the other. The upper one contained the operator, who was literally wedged into his position. Once in, he could do no more than move the control column. He steered the craft toward the target and then released the second torpedo, which was the one that went away and did the damage. Unfortunately, in some cases, the second torpedo wouldn't release, and when the motor was started, it took both of them to destruction.
Still, the tiny underwater vehicles of the Axis powers held their own. Few other weapons of the war created so much strategic advantage with so little investment of men and resources.
They were very successful in 2 ways. Firstly, in terms of shipping sunk or damaged. They accounted for just under 100,000 tons of British, American merchant shipping sunk, plus 2 British battleships damaged. But we must also look at their success in the wider term, in that they forced the British and later the Americans to spend a huge amount, both in resources and manpower, in fortifying every harbour in the Mediterranean.
In the Pacific, another revolution was taking place in the world of submarines. The Japanese Imperial Navy had created an entire fleet of midget watercraft called the Kohyoteki.
The war opened in the Pacific with the Japanese carrier attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. What a lot of people have forgotten is 5 Japanese midget submarines were also launched from large submarines to attack the ships inside the harbor. 1 or 2 of these did get into the harbor, did fire torpedoes.
In the end, 5 Kohyoteki were used at Pearl Harbor, and their success is open to interpretation. 1 was sunk outside the harbor entrance, 2 were sunk inside the harbor, 1 simply disappeared, no one knows what happened, and the 5th was washed ashore.
If you go to the Naval Academy in Japan, there's an exhibit of each man who had been in that submarine attack. They're like gods, but one of them isn't there, and it's the one man who survived. He's the first prisoner of war taken by the Americans.
The Kohyoteki midget submarines proved largely ineffective. But by 1945, with Allied victories against the Japanese, a new role was designed for the midget submarines: the suicide mission. 2 months before the better-known kamikaze flying squadron was created in 1944, Japanese naval officers had designed a kamikaze submarine.
These are suicide weapons. They're designed to be built cheaply and in large numbers, carrying a single-man crew who would expend himself against Allied shipping.
The suicide pilots and sailors accepted their fate, whether they went to their deaths in submarines, planes, or the specially designed kamikaze jet.
Had we not dropped the atomic bombs, there's no question that besides hundreds, if not thousands, of aerial kamikazes, our amphibious ships, our fire support ships, our landing craft themselves would have been attacked by thousands of these human torpedoes and these midget submarines.
In fact, several of the suicide sub-operators drove their crafts out to sea after the Japanese surrender to die like samurai in an active underwater harakiri. Throughout the war, the Allies would find themselves unprepared for attacks from tiny underwater weapons. Their response was to fight fire with fire, to create their own squadrons of secret submarines that would match their enemies in size and deadliness. When the British harbor at Alexandria was attacked by Italian midget submarines, the effect was devastating. The entire Allied fleet in the Mediterranean was crippled for the duration of the war. Word of the victory by the Italian 10th Flotilla reached Churchill himself, who, as former Lord of the Admiralty, had a special interest in the security of His Majesty's Navy.
Churchill was infuriated when news of Italian attacks reached him, and he demanded in one of his very, very testy notes as to why we weren't doing the same thing. So Britain's entry into this field was entirely reactive. The Italians had harmed us. We were going to use the same methods against them and the Germans.
The British Navy went to work building a special attack craft of its own, patterning its design after a captured Italian Miale. Once it was designed, an elite corps of Royal Navy volunteers began training to use the British version of the Italian Pig, now dubbed with the more dignified title of Chariot. By the end of 1943, the British were getting expert advice and guidance on using the human torpedo from their former enemy. With the surrender of Italy, members of the infamous 10th Flotilla now joined hands with the British Navy to train and even operate the chariots.
So you have the unique situation of former members of Decima Mas, freshly released from British prisoner of war camp, using British chariots to attack German-controlled Italian ships in Italian harbours. War makes strange bedfellows.
Another midget submarine was developed by the British, but this one was cloaked in secrecy. The British SOE, Special Operations Executive, was an espionage agency designed to cause confusion and destruction behind enemy lines. It was from SOE Labs that a unique creation emerged, a craft designated the Sleeping Beauty.
The Sleeping Beauty was the smallest operational submarine used in World War II. It also has another distinction. It was the only submarine up until that time that had ever been designed exclusively by and for an intelligence service. Now, it was quite effective. It had a maximum speed of 4.5 knots with a range of 12 miles, or if you slowed it down to 3 knots, you could go up to 40 miles. It was silent, it was fast, but it had no means of navigating. So what the SOA did was develop a system called porpoising, where the operator would surface, visually sight the compass or visually take a compass reading, then go underwater. It had a maximum depth of 50 feet, travel for a few hundred yards, come up again, surface, get its bearings, go underwater again. And this was very effective and was designed to evade detection by either a sentry on the shore or a lookout on a ship.
The Sleeping Beauty was also used by American OSS operatives and saw action in an attack on the Singapore harbor in June 1944. But a far more elaborate clandestine craft was being built by the best engineers of the Royal Navy. They called it the X-Craft.
The British X-Craft was a 4-man midget submarine, and it was perhaps the most successful of all the midget submarines built by any navy, largely because it was designed and built by professional naval architects who knew what they were doing. It had a lot of other uses other than sinking ships. For example, the British organisation COP, Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, used X-Craft to conduct covert reconnaissance of the Normandy beaches in January 1944, before the D-Day landings.
The mission the X-Craft would be most remembered for was the attack on the German battleship Tirpitz. Shown here at her christening, the Tirpitz was a seemingly unsinkable threat to Allied ships in the North Sea and on the supply routes between England and Russia. Six British X-Craft submarines were towed to the Norwegian fjords by submarine motherships in September 1943. Rear Admiral C.B. Berry would later call it one of the most courageous acts of all time, for it became a one-way mission for the British sailors involved.
Of the 6 craft that took part, 2 were lost on the journey from the UK to the Norwegian coast. X5 disappeared. No one knows what happened to her. X6 and X7 successfully entered Tirpitz's anchorage, laid their charges underneath the battleship, and then made their escape. But they were detected while doing so, shot at, and both were sunk, their crews becoming prisoners.
The captured X-Craft crews were taken aboard the Tirpitz herself just before the charges blew holes in the hull of the battleship and destroyed her turbines. Though they were now POWs, the British crews experienced the satisfaction of seeing the mighty Tirpitz crippled. With their successes and their failures, the midget submarines and clandestine sneak craft are a little-known story of World War II. These tiny underwater warriors sunk over 100,000 tons of shipping, despite the fact that they were small, primitive, and often as dangerous to their crews as to their targets. But nothing came close to the damage caused by the U-boats of the German Navy. They terrorized the Atlantic as the unchallenged masters of underwater warfare. Yet a lesser-known chapter of the war concerns the mysterious and just as legendary stories of the U-boat as a vehicle for spies. Perhaps the most successful weapon system of World War II was the German U-boat. Stealthy, quick, and powerful, the U-boat dominated the Atlantic Ocean. U-boat commanders called the early years of the war the happy time, during which they sank Allied shipping at will, unhampered and unconcerned by their enemies' ineffective anti-submarine measures.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the battle that we never won. The U-boat war started on September 3rd, 1939, when World War II began, and it didn't end until the middle of May 1945, when the last of them surrendered. It was the only weapon that also could really win the war for Hitler for most of the conflict.
Because it was so effective as a combat weapon, very little attention's been paid to the U-boat as a weapon of espionage and clandestine warfare. Yet these deadly ship killers played a small but vital role in the Nazi campaign to bring the war to America.
The Germans at the beginning of the war believed that the highest priority would be to destroy American ability to manufacture airplanes and other weapons of war. And so they decided to do a reprise of what the Germans had done in World War I, namely get people to commit acts of sabotage in the United States.
You have to remember that in 1942 there were no ballistic missiles and there were no long-range bombers, and so America was out of Hitler's reach. He couldn't drop a bomb on a steel mill or a munitions plant, so this was his way of slowing down American production.
The ambitious plan of the Nazis was to put highly trained teams of German operatives disguised as Americans on U.S. soil, armed with the best sabotage weaponry Germany could devise. The only way to insert the saboteurs was by sending U-boats to the very shores of America. On June 2nd, 1942, this plan, called Operation Pastorius, began. The submarine U-202 surfaced silently off the coast of Long Island. 4 men put ashore, carrying crates of explosives and fuses. A week later, 4 more German operatives landed off the coast of Florida, also carrying explosives, mines, and fuses, as well as detailed plans for a devastating strike at the very heart of the American war industry. But the sabotage operation failed completely. Within weeks, the German saboteurs were all in jail, their mission unmasked, their attack thwarted before it could even begin. And at the head of the roundup was the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover, who proudly announced his agency's good work.
The recent landing of saboteurs from Nazi submarines sounds a new alert for all Americans. These saboteurs were apprehended before they could carry out their plans of destruction.
The real story was much less dramatic. For the German saboteurs were not captured by good police work. The saboteurs were turned in by their own leader, George Dasch. Fellow saboteur Edgar Berger also confessed and helped the FBI find the Florida contingent. At this point in the investigation, J. Edgar Hoover himself stepped in.
J. Edgar Hoover at this stage did not enjoy a very good reputation with the American public or the American press, and he was going to use this opportunity to put himself back in the good graces with the American public. He was going to go down as the man who captured the 8 Nazi spies. And what he did was he used all of Dasch's and Berger's testimony to round up the spies and didn't give either Dasch or Berger any credit at all.
George Dasch and the other 7 operatives were given a military trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. To the dismay of Hoover, President Roosevelt intervened and commuted the sentences of Dasch and Berger to life imprisonment. The tale of German spies landing from U-boats became so well known that it began to take on a life of its own.
one of the effects of the landings of the saboteurs was it was greatly publicized. The public became knowledgeable about this, mostly because the FBI was so proud of what it had done. Well, it produces all kinds of rumors from Maine to Florida that there are saboteurs, that there are spies being landed by submarine. There are still people in Maine today who will tell you stories about submarines, German submarines landing men in Maine. They're going to ashore to buy fresh vegetables. It never happened, but there's wonderful stories.
As the war drew to a close in 1945, the U-boat entered the world of clandestine activities and the world of legend.
The end of World War II, as the battle for Berlin reached its crescendo and the Soviets captured the capital city, captured Hitler's bunker, Hitler was gone. Martin Bormann, one of his chief lieutenants, was gone. Some other officials were missing. End of World War II, where are the Nazi leaders? Where's Hitler? Where's Martin Bormann? Where are some of the other leaders? They can't be found. At the same time, some U-boats are missing.
Long after the Nazi defeat, there were persistent rumors of U-boats secretly ferrying out Nazi gold, Nazi weapons, and Nazi leaders. Tales spread of U-boats evading captivity with the cream of the Nazi high command, creating a veritable underwater Reich. U-boats were said to deliver Hitler himself to Argentina, where the Nazis planned to rise again. The rumors had a clear basis in established facts, but the facts were much less dramatic than the legends.
Two of the German U-boats, when they were all ordered to surrender, decided they did not want to be imprisoned by the Allies. They would take their submarines across the Atlantic to South America, where they would be interned in neutral countries. But these two submarines disappear, and then they appear a couple of months later in South American countries. The thought is that these were used to clandestinely carry possibly Hitler, certainly Martin Bormann, and other German bigwigs out of the Reich to South America. Well, in reality, the only people on those two submarines were their crews.
To me, there's a lot of irony in the fact that Germany gets invincible in legend when it wasn't invincible in reality. I mean, in legend, Germans do all kinds of things. I mean, they get submarines to deliver their leaders to South America. They get submarines to take sacred German objects and hide them in Antarctica. All kinds of legends grow up. But the legends, nothing ever comes of any of this. None of them is true. But there's something about a submarine in an awful lot of those legends.
The legends of escaping U-boats and secret submarines are some of the most compelling tales of World War II, whether or not there is any truth to them. For the submarine, by its very nature, is surrounded by an air of mystery and intrigue.
There's a certain psychological fear of submarines because you never know when it's going to appear, and the first sign you'll have there's a submarine is a torpedo hitting your ship. So I wouldn't use the word romance, but there's a certain mystique about them.
Mystique aside, there is no doubt that submarines played an important, if little-known, role in clandestine operations of World War II. And it was from the discoveries made in World War II that submarines became the premier weapon of spycraft during the Cold War. The nuclear power behemoths that functioned as electronic eavesdroppers, spy senders, and mobile arsenals, the military muscle of the Cold War, could not have served as effectively without the lessons learned in such missions is the attack of the X-craft, the gold evacuation of the USS Trout, and the harbor raids of the Sleeping Beauty. The very fact that the story of the secret submarines is almost unknown to the world at large perhaps proves the success of these strange and mysterious craft as unique weapons in the arsenal of the spy.